As the storm raged outside, Officer John Keller stood in the rain-soaked woods, heart racing. His partner, the young K-9 Duke, was ahead, nose to the ground, eyes sharp and focused. The air was thick with tension. Time was running out. Somewhere, in the darkness, a child was lost and the storm was only getting worse. John's grip tightened on the leash as Duke suddenly froze, ears perked. Without a word, Duke bolted forward, disappearing into the thick brush. "Duke, wait!" John shouted, fear gripping him as he raced to catch up. Every second counted. Would they find the child in time, or was it already too late? As John pushed through the trees, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just another call. This was a test of everything he had learned, everything Rex had taught him. And in the dark heart of the storm, he knew only one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The sun had barely dipped behind the rooftops of Pineview, New Jersey, when the street fell eerily silent. Elm Street, once filled with the sounds of children playing and the occasional hum of backyard grills, now stood frozen in time. The air, which normally carried the light scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant sound of radios playing sports games, had been replaced by the steady hum of sirens. The only light came from the slow, pulsing flash of red and blue patrol lights, casting long shadows against the houses. Uniformed officers lined both sides of the street, standing shoulder to shoulder in solemn salute. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe. In the center of it all, carrying the lifeless body of K-9 Rex, was Officer John Keller. John had always known that this day would come, but nothing could prepare him for the weight of this moment. Rex had been more than a partner. Over the 6 years they had worked together, Rex had become John's companion, his confidant, his reason to keep going. The bond between them was undeniable, something beyond words. Rex was more than a dog. He was a protector, a soldier, a true friend. Earlier that day, they had responded to a hostage situation. A call had come in that a man was holding a family hostage in their home, and John and Rex were the first to arrive. The situation was tense and the stakes were high. Rex, with his keen sense of smell and sharp instincts, was invaluable. But it all happened so fast. The moment Rex lunged through the shattered window to intercept the armed suspect, everything had shifted. There was a shot, a single, deafening shot, and then silence. John had heard the shot. He had seen Rex's body go limp as he landed on the ground, but in that split second he had only one thought in his mind: to make sure the children in the house were safe. The armed suspect was apprehended, but at what cost? John had rushed to Rex's side, his heart sinking as he realized that his partner, his best friend, wasn't going to make it. Now, as John walked through the empty street carrying Rex's lifeless form in his arms, each step felt heavier. The weight wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement echoed through the street, but it was drowned out by the quiet murmurs of grief from the onlookers. The officers who stood in silent salute, the civilians who lined the street, all of them understood the loss. They all knew Rex. He had been more than just a K-9 officer. He had been a hero to the town, a silent protector who kept them safe without ever asking for anything in return. As John approached the center of the street, he saw the faces of the people who had known Rex. Mrs. Sylvia Bradford, whose daughter had been saved by Rex when she got lost in the woods 2 years ago, wiped tears from her eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Logan, the owners of the local bakery, stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly, their eyes full of sadness. They had all seen Rex in action, and now they mourned the loss of the dog who had served the town with such loyalty. John's heart ached as he saw these familiar faces. Rex had been a part of their lives, just as he had been a part of John's. But even in his grief, John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Rex had given everything for his community, just as John had tried to do. And even in death, Rex would be remembered, not as just a K-9 officer, but as a true hero. As John reached the end of the block, his patrol SUV sat waiting. It was parked under a dim streetlight, its door open, inviting him to step inside. But John couldn't bring himself to leave just yet, not without honoring his partner one last time. He stopped in his tracks as he felt a shift in the air. He looked behind him and saw Officer Nolan Creed, one of the newer officers, step forward. Nolan's face, usually steady and unreadable, now shimmered with emotion under the flickering patrol lights. John's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening, something John wasn't prepared for. As Nolan walked closer, John instinctively tightened his grip around Rex's body. The other officers began to stir, some pulling small items from their pockets, others reaching into their uniforms. It was an old tradition, one that John had only heard about from the oldest veterans. It was a silent oath, a vow to honor the fallen by carrying on in their memory. The officers moved in unison, tying strips of black cloth to the handles of their sidearms, their badges, and even the antennas of their radios. No orders had been given. No plan had been spoken aloud. But every officer, from the rookie to the veteran, knew what they had to do. They were mourning not just a colleague, but a brother. And in that moment, John realized that Rex's sacrifice was bigger than just one life. It was a symbol of everything they stood for: duty, bravery, and loyalty. John's throat tightened as the townsfolk too began to step forward. Mrs. Bradford was the first to approach, her silver hair glowing in the light as she knelt beside Rex. She whispered something softly, too quiet for anyone else to hear, before tying a small handkerchief embroidered with blue flowers around the handle of John's belt. The Morans were next. Alaric, his hands shaking, removed a faded ribbon from his wrist, a token from his late wife, and carefully tied it around John's radio. Each gesture, each token of remembrance, felt like a blessing, a way of saying thank you to a hero who had given everything. As John continued to walk, the weight of the grief felt heavier, but there was also something else, something deep within him that pushed him to keep going. Rex's memory would live on in the town, in the hearts of the people who had been touched by his courage and loyalty. With every step, John felt a sense of finality, but also a sense of honor. Rex's legacy was one that would never be forgotten. And as the procession continued, John knew that he would carry that legacy with him no matter where the road would take him next. The funeral procession stretched far beyond what John had expected. Pineview, a small town tucked away from the busy world, was a place where everyone knew everyone else. It was a town built on familiarity, on faces that had become like family over the years. But this was something different. The loss of Rex, the town's hero, had affected everyone. It wasn't just a funeral, it was a collective mourning for a protector they had all come to rely on. As John walked slowly through the streets, his hands still tightly gripping Rex's body, the town of Pineview seemed to hold its breath. The sky had darkened and the first cool breeze of autumn brushed against the mourners. The lights of the street lamps flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the entire street. There was an air of reverence, a quiet stillness that seemed to envelop the town. The officers, still standing at attention, remained as statues in the night. Each one held a small piece of fabric tied to their uniforms or sidearms, tokens of respect and remembrance for Rex's service. The black ribbons and handkerchiefs fluttered slightly in the breeze, like silent flags honoring a fallen comrade. The town had come to pay tribute, and it was clear that they would do so in a way that honored Rex's bravery. As John reached the town's memorial square, he paused for a moment, taking in the scene. The street was lined with residents, some of whom were holding their children's hands, while others stood quietly, hands folded over their hearts. The young and the old, the officers and the civilians, they all stood together, united by the deep loss of a beloved hero. The moment was heavy, and John's heart ached as he looked around. He knew Rex had been a symbol of protection for the town, but he never realized just how deeply Rex's actions had affected people until now. Rex had been a silent protector, but his legacy had reached far beyond the K-9 unit. He had saved lives, comforted families, and stood guard over the streets of Pineview with unwavering loyalty. John's steps faltered as he moved toward the small park where the memorial service would take place. The sound of his boots on the pavement was drowned out by the hum of soft voices, the occasional sniffle, and the low murmur of grief that echoed through the crowd. The mourners, some in tears, others with solemn expressions, moved toward the small gazebo where a podium stood. At the front, Pineview's police chief, Linda Matthews, stood waiting to deliver the service. John had worked with Chief Matthews for years, but today he saw her with a different understanding. Her usual stern face, known to all in the department, was soft, almost tender. She had seen loss before, but this was different. This was personal. Rex had been her friend too, just as much as he had been John's. John could see it in her eyes as she watched him approach, her gaze filled with both sorrow and strength. "Thank you all for being here," Chief Matthews began, her voice steady, but heavy. "Today we remember not just a K-9 officer but a hero. Rex was more than a dog. He was family. He kept us safe and he loved us without question. His loyalty and courage knew no bounds, and we will never forget the sacrifices he made for us." John could hear the catch in her voice as she spoke. He could feel the weight of the words in the air and it made him ache with grief, but there was also a sense of pride. Pride in knowing that Rex's legacy would live on in Pineview, in the people who had been touched by his bravery. Chief Matthews continued, recounting stories of Rex's heroic actions, of the times he had saved lives, of the countless moments of companionship he had offered to officers after long, grueling shifts. John's throat tightened as he listened to each story. Each one felt like a reminder of the bond they had shared, a bond that could never be replaced. When the service ended, the crowd remained still, as if not wanting to disturb the solemn atmosphere. People stood in quiet contemplation, each one reflecting on their own memories of Rex. John felt a hand on his shoulder and he turned to find Officer William Price standing beside him. William was one of the younger officers, a rookie when John and Rex had first started working together. But over the years he had become a trusted colleague and a good friend. "Are you okay?" William asked softly, his voice filled with concern. John took a deep breath, looking around at the town that had come together to honor Rex. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's just so overwhelming. I never realized how much Rex meant to everyone here. He was always more than just a partner to me. But now, seeing how much he's touched these lives, it's hard to put into words." William nodded, understanding, without needing to say more. It was in moments like this that John realized the true strength of community, the way people could come together in their shared grief, in their shared love for someone who had given everything to protect them. So as the crowd slowly began to disperse, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. Rex's service had been more than just a job. It had been a calling. And now, in the silence of the town square, John knew that he had to carry Rex's memory forward, not just as a fallen officer, but as a hero who had made a difference in every life he touched. But there was something else John needed to do, something that weighed heavily on his heart. He had to let go. Just a little. Rex's legacy would live on, but it was time for John to find a way to move forward, to continue, serving and protecting the town with the same dedication and courage that Rex had shown. As John stood at the memorial, a quiet thought crossed his mind. He wasn't alone in his grief. The entire town, the entire department was mourning alongside him. And in that unity, in that shared sense of loss, there was something deeply comforting. He wasn't facing this journey by himself. Rex's spirit would live on in them all. The days following Rex's memorial service felt like an endless blur for John. The grief had settled into him like a weight he couldn't shake. He had always known the day would come when he'd lose his partner, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional toll it took to let go. Rex had been more than a K-9 officer. He had been a companion, a friend, a piece of John's soul. But now, standing in the K-9 unit's training field, John was faced with the reality that he had to move forward. There was no other choice. The training field, once filled with excitement and the sounds of Rex's bark as he chased after balls, felt empty now. The hurdles stood silently in the grass, the cones untouched, and the air was still. John stood at the edge of the field, staring at the empty space where he and Rex had spent so many hours working side by side. It seemed like a lifetime ago that Rex had been here, his loyal eyes always focused on John, ready for whatever task was ahead. But now, there was only silence. It was here, standing alone, that John began to understand something. He would never replace Rex. That wasn't possible. Rex was a legend, a hero who had saved countless lives. But there was a new path ahead of him, a new chapter that he had to write. The idea of moving on felt impossible, but it wasn't just about replacing Rex. It was about continuing what they had started together. And maybe, just maybe, the right partner would help him find his way. John's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see Officer William Price, the young officer who had worked with him and Rex for the past few years. William had been hesitant about stepping into Rex's shoes, but he had offered his support since the day Rex fell. Now, standing at the edge of the field, William gave John a small, encouraging smile. "I brought someone with me," William said, his voice hesitant but filled with a quiet understanding. From behind him, John could see a young German shepherd standing patiently, looking up at him with bright, eager eyes. The dog was different from Rex. His fur was a little darker, his build smaller, but there was something about him, something familiar. He could see it in the dog's stance, the way he held himself as if he knew this was his moment. "This is Duke," William said softly, stepping aside to let the dog approach. "He's a little green, but he's been through the basics. I thought maybe you could start working with him." John stared at Duke for a moment, feeling a lump rise in his throat. The young dog's eyes were full of curiosity, and he wagged his tail, eager to please. But John wasn't sure he was ready. How could he train another K9 when it still felt like he had just lost the most important partner of his life? But then, something inside him shifted. It wasn't about replacing Rex. It was about honoring his memory and continuing the work they had started. Duke wasn't Rex, but maybe he didn't have to be. Maybe Duke could be something new, something that would help John heal, even if it was just a little at a time. With a sigh, John crouched down and held out his hand to Duke. The young dog stepped forward cautiously, sniffing John's palm before nuzzling it gently. There was a sense of trust in that moment, something John hadn't felt in days. It was the beginning of a new bond, though it was still fragile and uncertain. But John could feel a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "You're not Rex," John whispered to the dog, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're going to have to do for now." William smiled, giving John the space he needed to connect with the dog. "He's got potential," he said quietly. "I've seen it in him. He just needs someone to believe in him." John nodded, looking down at Duke, who was now sitting patiently in front of him, waiting for the next command. It was time to start anew. Slowly, John stood up and gave Duke his first command. "Sit." The dog obeyed without hesitation, his eyes locked on John, eager to please. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. John felt a spark of pride, a sense of accomplishment that had been missing for so long. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time since Rex's death, John felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, John spent hours working with Duke. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of frustration when the young dog didn't seem to understand or follow the commands as well as Rex had. But with each passing day, Duke became more attuned to John's cues, more responsive to his voice. It wasn't the same as working with Rex, but it was progress. One evening, after a particularly challenging training session, John sat on a bench by the field, his eyes fixed on the ground. His body was sore, his heart still heavy with the weight of loss. But as Duke walked over and sat beside him, resting his head on John's knee, John couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting Rex, it meant carrying his spirit forward one step at a time. "Good boy, Duke," John whispered, his voice soft. The dog nuzzled his hand, a small but comforting gesture. In that moment, John realized that it wasn't about filling the empty space left by Rex. It was about finding a way to honor that bond while creating something new. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be days when the grief felt overwhelming, days when John would miss Rex's steady presence beside him. But he wasn't alone anymore. With Duke by his side, John felt like he had a chance to rebuild, to continue the work he and Rex had started together. And as they walked off the training field together, the fading light of the day casting long shadows behind them, John knew that this new beginning was just that. A beginning. It was the first step toward healing, toward finding peace, and toward carrying on the legacy of a fallen hero. Duke wasn't a replacement for Rex. He was a new chapter, one that would help John move forward while still keeping Rex's memory alive. And in that, John found a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The days that followed John's first real training session with Duke were a whirlwind of emotions. The loss of Rex still loomed over him like a heavy cloud, casting its shadow over everything. Yet as the days turned into weeks, John found himself gradually adjusting to the idea of working alongside Duke. The young dog, eager and full of energy, had begun to prove himself in small, significant ways. He wasn't Rex, but he was something else, something new, something full of potential. It had been a difficult transition, one that left John feeling torn between the past and the present. The guilt that had plagued him after Rex's death hadn't entirely faded, and there were still moments when John caught himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, Rex could have done things differently, could have made it out alive. But those thoughts, though sharp, were starting to fade into the background as Duke's loyalty and determination began to shine through. Every small victory with Duke, the perfect execution of a command, the successful completion of a training, reminded John that this wasn't about replacing Rex. It was about continuing the work Rex had started. And in that sense, Duke was exactly what John needed. It wasn't long before the call came. Another missing person case, another life at stake. The circumstances were different this time. The search was in the woods outside of Pineview, an area that had once been the site of a major rescue Rex had led. John's heart ached with the memories of that day, but he knew that Rex wouldn't want him to hesitate. He had trained Duke for moments like this, and now it was time to put their bond to the test. The storm had been building for hours, the sky heavy with thick clouds, and the first raindrops began to fall as John and Duke made their way to the woods. The rain fell in sheets, soaking through their clothes and making the ground beneath them soft and treacherous. But John barely noticed. His focus was entirely on Duke. He was still a rookie in many ways, but John saw something in the young dog that reminded him of Rex, an undeniable determination, a will to succeed, a drive to protect. John snapped the lead onto Duke's harness, giving the young dog a firm pat on the head. "Find," he said, his voice steady but full of purpose. Duke didn't hesitate. He lowered his head and bolted forward, his tail held low but moving steadily through the wet underbrush. John followed closely behind, every step echoing in the thick silence of the woods. The rain grew heavier, drenching them both, but Duke didn't seem to mind. His focus was unshakable. The air was thick with moisture and the scent of wet earth, but Duke's nose never wavered. He was on the trail. John's heart pounded as they moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of the storm masking every noise except for the rustle of leaves and the occasional bark from Duke. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as they moved. Through the trees, the world reduced to the sound of Duke's breathing and the muffled thud of John's boots on the soggy ground. Hours passed, the rain continuing to pour down relentlessly, soaking both man and dog. John's legs were aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he trudged through the mud. They had found a few clues along the way, clumps of hair caught on branches, footprints muddied by the rain, but the missing child was still nowhere to be found. The sinking feeling in John's chest grew with each passing minute. He couldn't afford to lose this one, not again. Then, as if responding to John's anxiety, Duke's ears perked up. The dog stopped suddenly, his nose working furiously in the damp air. Without warning, he darted to the left, disappearing into a thicket of trees. John hesitated for a moment, then followed. his heart racing as he pushed through the thick undergrowth. It felt like an eternity before he caught up to Duke, who was barking excitedly at the base of a large fallen tree. When John reached the spot, his heart nearly stopped. There, curled up beneath the branches, was a small figure, shivering, soaked to the bone but alive. The child was pale, his small body trembling from the cold and fear, but he was breathing, and he was safe. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as he knelt down beside the boy, pulling him into his arms and wrapping him in his jacket. The child's wide, terrified eyes locked onto John's, and for a moment, everything else faded away. In that instant, John knew he had done what Rex would have done. He had saved a life. "Hang in there, buddy," John whispered, trying to reassure the boy as he radioed for help. "You're going to be okay." Duke stood by their side, barking, happily, his tail wagging. John looked at him, his heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just a moment of survival. It was a testament to everything that Rex had taught him. Rex's legacy was not just in the heroic actions of the past. It was in moments like these, in the way John continued to protect Pineview, just as Rex had done so many times before. When the rescue team arrived, John felt a rush of relief, but it wasn't just for the boy's safety. It was for Duke, too. They had done it together. The bond they had started to build was solidifying, and in that moment, John realized that he wasn't just honoring Rex's memory. He was creating something new, something just as important as what they had shared. Duke wasn't just a replacement. He was a continuation, a new chapter in the story of service, of loyalty, and of protection. The walk back through the woods was quieter, but John felt a new sense of calm settle over him. The storm had finally stopped, and the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. As he walked beside Duke, the young dog's stride matching his, John felt the weight of his grief lighten just a little bit. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was clear that he and Duke were ready to face whatever came next, together. And when they reached the station, the first thing John did was kneel down to Duke's level and offer a soft, "Good job, boy." Duke's tail wagged furiously as he nuzzled John's face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself to smile. It wasn't the same as the smile he had shared with Rex, but it was a start, a new beginning.